I'm reminded of an anecdote which Max Gluckman narrated to me once. Those of you who knew Max will remember that he was a tall, rather masterful man with a very large voice. And he had gone to give an address somewhere in the United States, and he must have held the audience spellbound. And at the end of it, a rather tremulous young woman walked up to him and lost her speech and said, Professor Gluckman, you're so famous, I thought you must be dead. I am quite unlike Max Gluckman, a rather nervous speaker in the best of times. But seeing Alan Macfarlane pointing his gun at me makes me even more nervous. I have the sense that I'm not only addressing this very distinguished audience, but speaking out to future generations. And that is a daunting feeling. Let me get down to my paper and say that my main concern in it is about the identity of social anthropology and continuity and change in the identity of social anthropology. But this identity, I think, has two aspects. One is the identity of anthropology as a discipline, as an intellectual system, with its distinctive subject of study and its distinctive orientation to that subject of study. But I'm also interested in the identity of anthropology, not just as an intellectual discipline, but also in its identity as a profession. How that profession is organized, how it is composed, and so on. And when I look at the identity of anthropology as an intellectual discipline, I find that there is both continuity and change, but I am struck more by the continuity, particularly when I see it in relation to sociology. Of course, there have been changes in the last 60 years, new methods, concepts, techniques have developed, but by and large, I'm struck more by the continuities, and particularly when I see it in relation to sociology. But when I look at anthropology as a profession, I notice quite important changes in the composition of the profession. When this association began 60 years ago, practically all anthropologists in the world were either Europeans or Americans. This has changed over the last 60 years. And I think that this change has important implications. I don't quite know what those implications are, but I suspect that they will have important implications for the way in which anthropologists define their subject of study and orientate themselves to their subject. In an entertaining talk broadcast by the BBC more than 50 years ago, the pugnacious American sociologist George Homans set out to explain why the British were mistrustful of sociology, while they seemed, on the whole, to be well disposed towards anthropology. At that time, the older universities of Oxford and Cambridge had departments of anthropology, but no department of sociology. Cambridge was making hesitant moves to establish a department of sociology. Out of prudence, it decided to invite a set of visiting professors from the United States. So first Lloyd Warner, then Talcott Parsons, and they were given rough music. Homans, who was the third, came prepared, and he gave back as good as he got. After patiently pointing out that the British had shown considerable enthusiasm and success in the study of the social lives of medieval serfs and villains, of natives in their far-flung empire, and even of birds and animals, he asked why they showed such great reluctance to study people of their own kind. Sociology was little more than the study of social interaction and social relations. So why should those who had such a keen aptitude for studying These very phenomena, as historians, as anthropologists, and as ethologists, be so averse to the discipline of sociology? This was Homans' question. Homans answered his own question in the following words, and I quote, "Faced with these facts, elementary scientific method suggests that one should ask what characteristics the medieval villain, the native, and the robin possess in common. I have been able to discover only one. They cannot read sociology, or what amounts to the same thing, they cannot answer back." I don't wish to enter into the merits of Homans' argument as a whole. What concerns me here is that Homans took it for granted that sociologists and anthropologists study different subjects, and that their orientations to their subjects of study are different. In this respect, he was expressing the common sense among students of society and culture in both Britain and the United States at the time. Sociologists studied their own kinds of people in the advanced industrial societies. Anthropologists studied other kinds of people in villages or camps or reservations. Homans did not question the common sense underlying the distinction. He was only arguing, I think wrongly, that the British did not regard their own contemporary society as a proper subject of study. How far has this common sense changed since Homans' time? For Radcliffe Brown, the first president of the Association of Social Anthropologists, the unity of sociology and social anthropology was an article of faith. He sought to develop a common approach and a common body of concepts for the systematic and comparative study of all human societies everywhere. He never tired of repeating that social anthropology was only another name for comparative sociology. If we examine how the study of society and culture is organized in Britain and the United States today, we will have to concede that it is Homans' common sense which has prevailed over Radcliffe Brown's intellectual agenda. Ironically, the division of subject matter between anthropology and sociology began to harden as the two disciplines acquired more secure empirical foundations. Anthropologists and sociologists chose not only different settings for their studies, but also different methods and techniques for the collection of data. Anthropologists went to remote, unfamiliar, and exotic places for their fieldwork, learning a new language and enduring the hardships of an alien environment. They emphasized and sometimes exaggerated the peculiarities of the people among whom they had lived and worked. Sociologists, on the other hand, stayed at home and investigated populations of the kind to which they themselves belonged. I've been told by more than one anthropologist in Britain that sociology is a rather dull subject. It is difficult for a sociologist in Britain to feel about black-coated workers or suburban housewives the same kind of thrill that an English anthropologist might feel about encounters in the New Guinea highlands or the Brazilian rainforests. What were the defining features of the communities that anthropologists went out to study in the field? Until well into the 20th century, anthropologists did not feel shy about describing as primitive the people about whom they wrote. The textbooks on which I had cut my teeth as an undergraduate student of anthropology in Calcutta had such titles as Primitive Culture by Tyler, Primitive Society by Lowy, and The Mind of Primitive Man by Boas. The term primitive came in course of time to be replaced by pre-literate and other euphemisms. Intensive fieldwork brought about a change of attitude and orientation towards the people the anthropologists studied, though not immediately, not with Malinowski himself. Also, important changes in the political climate began to take place after decolonization. Gradually, terms suggestive of disparagement came to be considered unprofessional. It is now no longer possible to call a textbook of anthropology primitive culture, although it is acceptable when called other cultures. Some changes did indeed come about in the course of the 20th century in the attitudes and orientations of anthropologists towards the people they study. But much continuity was also maintained. A major new development that began around the time of World War II was the entry by anthropologists into the study of peasant communities in Latin America, Asia, and elsewhere. This development gathered momentum with decolonization, and American universities established departments and centers of area studies in which anthropologists had a prominent place. I might point out that if you look at these departments of area studies in the United States, you will find in them anthropologists, of course, geographers, political scientists, demographers, all kinds of people, but rarely ever a sociologist. A sociologist in the United States cannot be found in a department of area studies because area studies departments are concerned with countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Robert Redfield, who was a pioneer in the anthropological study of peasantry, described peasant communities as part societies and part cultures. Unlike the tribal community of classical anthropology, the peasant community was not complete in itself. As an anthropologist, Redfield himself took an interest in towns and cities and encouraged those who worked with him to do so. Anthropologists brought something new into studies of civilization, if only because their studies grew out of field-based research on little communities. But the civilizations to which anthropologists devoted their attention were mainly non-Western ones. The anthropological study of civilization did not efface the distinction between Western and non-Western societies as subjects of study. It was no doubt an advance of some kind to move from the study of primitive or pre-literate or even peasant communities to that of civilizations. But the line of division separating the West from the rest refused to disappear. More than 40 years ago, the Chinese-American anthropologist Francis Su had pointed out how Western scholars had misrepresented the reality by treating all civilizations other than the Western as Oriental. They were certainly interested in difference, but their primary interest was in the difference between Western and all other civilizations, and not in the differences among those civilizations themselves. Jack Goody is certainly right when he says, and I quote, "Many anthropologists have tended to regard their generalizations, their concepts, their procedures, as applying to elementary structures," to use the phrase incorporated in the title of Levi-Strauss's book, which are seen to range from Australian Aborigines to the inhabitants of China and India. The result is a tendency to primitivize the Oriental civilizations, unquote. The fascination for the primitive, the exotic, and the alien is too deeply rooted in the traditions of anthropology and the work habits of anthropologists to be exorcised by a mere change in the climate of political opinion. Although they have made occasional forays into Western society, Western anthropologists have not felt fully at ease about studying their own society by the methods and techniques characteristic of their discipline. In modern anthropology, the celebration of the primitive found its most eloquent exponent in Claude Lévi-Strauss. No other anthropologist of his generation has influenced students of society and culture in the way in which he has. And his influence has extended far beyond the boundaries of the discipline. Among his predecessors, only the name of Malinowski had the kind of magic that came to be associated with his. From Tristopic to the view from afar, Lévi-Strauss has argued consistently for the privileged standpoint of the anthropologist as outsider and distant observer. The vocation of the anthropologist in this representation is that of the explorer who travels to distant lands in order to discover the limits of difference and otherness. This exploration is both an intellectual and an aesthetic experience. The contrast between sociology, or the study of ourselves, and anthropology, or the study of others, has figured repeatedly in the writings of Levi-Strauss. Contrasting sociology with anthropology, he wrote, I quote, "Sociology is concerned with the observer's society, or a society at the same time," unquote. The context makes it quite clear that here the author has in mind Western, that is European or American society. By contrast, I quote again, "The anthropologist is the astronomer of the social sciences. His task is to discover a meaning for configurations which, owing to their size and remoteness, are very different from those within the observer's immediate purview." No doubt, anthropology, sociology, and indeed all the human sciences aim ultimately at a deeper understanding of the human condition. Ultimate aims and tendencies have generally been divergent. Here I am concerned more with the proximate than the ultimate aim of the discipline, and not just with what their proponents say their aims are, but also with the procedures by which they pursue those aims. As I have already indicated, the distinction between the two disciplines became clearer as each of them acquired its own particular empirical focus. The distinction between sociology and anthropology, or ethnology, was not made as clearly in the Année sociologique as it was by later scholars, although there is a telling passage in the elementary forms of the religious life in which it is made clearly enough. So long as they continue to be organized as different disciplines and different professions, the need to provide an intellectual justification for the difference will remain. When I look back on the development of social anthropology in Europe and the United States since World War I, I am struck as much by the continued separation between it and sociology as by the many innovations in theory and method that have taken place within anthropology. In 1992 or 93, the British Academy reclassified its sections according to disciplines. Until that time, sociology and social anthropology were in one section together. After 93, sociology and anthropology were separated. Sociology was placed with demography and various other disciplines, and anthropology was placed with geography. I was really dismayed by this putting together of anthropology and geography, but I think that, if one looks at it closely, one will see that there is a certain rationale behind it. Even while Levi-Strauss was confidently describing anthropologists as the astronomers of the social sciences, a slow, steady, and irreversible change had begun in the composition of the profession about which he was writing. At the end of World War I, the vast majority of anthropologists were Europeans or Americans. Today, anthropologists in countries outside the West are numerous, and one can think of a future not too far away when they will outnumber European and American anthropologists. A change in the composition of the profession is bound to have consequences for a discipline, not for every discipline, but is bound to have consequences for a discipline which defines itself as the study of other societies and other cultures. When most anthropologists were Europeans or Americans, the study of other cultures and the study of primitive or less developed societies were much the same. But from the standpoint of an Indian or a Sri Lankan student of society and culture, the situation is replete with contradictions and tensions. When an Indian student goes to the United States to do a PhD, if his work is on social stratification in America, he will be placed in a department of sociology, even though he is studying a society that is other than his own. If, on the other hand, he wishes to come back to study family and kinship in his hometown in India, he will be counted in his American university as an anthropologist, even though he is writing a thesis on his own society and culture. Indians are now in demand in American universities, but in departments of anthropology. I've known very outstanding, talented, able Indian scholars who are sucked into departments of anthropology in American universities, even though they are not by training anthropologists, But I don't know of many examples of Indian students of their own society who have found positions in American departments of sociology. Without insisting on a clear or direct relationship between the social situation of a scholar and his intellectual orientation or standpoint, it should be reasonable to presume that a person who studies a subject in the tradition of a discipline that defines itself as the study of other cultures is likely to arrive at a different view of it from the one taken by someone who investigates it as a part of the study of his own society. We have known since Max Weber that the standpoint of the intellectual matters, although surely it is not the only thing that matters. Those who sought to separate the study of other cultures from the study of one's own society were Europeans or Americans, and they obviously gave little thought to how the distinction might work in universities and other centers of study and research in India or in Indonesia or in Nigeria. In the initial phase of the comparative study of human societies and cultures worldwide, those who undertook the studies were all Europeans or Americans. The first and perhaps the most successful venture of this kind was the work done by the scholars associated with the Année Sociologique between 1898 and 1914. This small group of scholars undertook the study of all societies and all cultures, ranging from the Australian Aborigines through the Pueblo Indians, the Indians of India, the Chinese and the Europeans, with the application of a common body of concepts, methods and theories. As is well known, the venture did not last very long. It was halted by the outbreak of World War I, and after that, the explosive growth of systematic empirical investigation into both primitive and advanced societies made its revival extremely difficult. 100 years ago, those who studied human societies comparatively were all Europeans or Americans. There were no Asians or Africans among the anthropologists or sociologists of the time, or at least none who would be recognized as one by the Année Sociologique. While Durkheim saw the merit of bringing every possible type of society on the same plane of observation and analysis, he took it for granted that the observation and the analysis would all be made by scholars from one type of society, that is, the type to which he himself belonged. Ethnographic studies began to be made in India from the second half of the 19th century onwards. The first ethnographers were missionaries and administrators from Britain and other Western countries who sought to catalogue the social customs of the natives and the innumerable social divisions among them. They soon began to train and use Indian assistants for the conduct of their studies. Colonial administration played an important part in laying the foundations of anthropology in India. The Anthropological Survey of India, whose origins go back to colonial times, continues its existence as one of the largest organizations of its kind in the world. The practice of anthropology did not remain confined to administrators, missionaries, and their assistants for very long. It came to be adopted as a university subject not very long after its adoption in the Western universities. It's a difference of about 20 years or so. By 1921 or 22, Calcutta University has a department of anthropology. Not surprisingly, Indian anthropologists began by collecting the same kinds of data that were being collected by British and other Western ethnographers in India. And by and large, they adopted concepts and methods developed in the West. There was a strong emphasis on the study of primitive tribes, even by the Indian anthropologists in the 1920s, because that is what they felt anthropology was about. There was a strong emphasis on the study of primitive tribes, and since the native anthropologists were almost all upper caste Hindus, there was a kind of social and cultural distance between the observer and the observed. At the same time, the more sensitive among the Indian anthropologists quickly realized, this takes just about 15 or 20 years, they quickly realized that there were similarities as well as interconnections between the customs of the primitive tribes and their own customs. What is undeniable, while it is undeniable that anthropology came to India in the wake of colonial rule, it is by no means the case that Indian anthropologists, including those who were trained in Britain or by the British in India, followed blindly and mechanically the intellectual agenda of colonial rule. This is a point which is made over and over again by Indian and American anthropologists, American and Indian anthropologists who work in India, that Indian anthropologists followed mechanically and blindly what was doled out to them. But this is not, I think this is totally wrong. Many of these Indian anthropologists were acutely conscious of being the bearers of an ancient intellectual tradition that had become ossified, but that they hoped could be rejuvenated by exposure to new methods, new concepts, and new theories. If one can speak of the standpoint of the colonial or the missionary anthropologist, one can speak also of the standpoint of the nationalist anthropologist, and the two came into contention from almost the very start. The defining features of the standpoint of the nationalist anthropologist was the postulate of the unity of India. Indian anthropologists such as G.S. Gurrier and N.K. Bose argued that in India, tribal and non-tribal communities were parts of a single civilization. Colonial anthropologists and the first two professors of anthropology in the University of Cambridge, the first two William Weiss professors of anthropology, had both started their careers as colonial administrators. Watson of the ICS, who was the first William Weiss professor of anthropology in Cambridge, and J.H. Hutton, his successor, who was the second William Weiss professor, they were both administrators in the Indian civil service. Colonial anthropologists, on the other hand, were inclined to stress the distinctiveness of tribal culture and the separateness of the tribes from the rest of the Indian population. The divergence between the two standpoints came out in the acrimonious debate in the mid-40s between G.S. Gurrier, the first professor of sociology at Bombay University, but trained by the anthropologist W.H.R. Rivers in Cambridge, and Verrier Relvin, the self-trained anthropologist who came out to India to work as a missionary, but adopted Indian citizenship after independence. It will not be too great an exaggeration to say that the natural tendency in India is to stress the unity of sociology and anthropology, whereas in the West, the natural tendency is for them to stay apart. As I have indicated, in India, the real expansion of the profession of anthropology took place only after independence. Has the change in the last 60 years been only a quantitative one, or has there also been a change of orientation and direction? This is an extremely complicated, I can only raise the question. The flow of Western scholars into India did not diminish, but it increased after independence. Apart from senior scholars who came to teach or do research, there were students working under the supervision of Indian professors, and a few even took degrees from Indian universities. Thus, a kind of reciprocity of relations between scholars of different provenance and with different orientations came into being. But this reciprocity was by no means complete. Exchanges of views between Indian and Western anthropologists did indeed take place at seminars and conferences. But the Western anthropologists came mainly to do fieldwork and to collect data, rather than to learn about concepts, methods, and theories. And for every one American scholar who came to study in India, there were at least 10 Indians who went to complete their studies in the United States. A notable feature of the exchange of scholars was that those who came from the West to study society and culture in India were mainly anthropologists. Hardly any American or British sociologist came to do research in India. This was in conformity with the established division of labor among students of culture and society in America and Britain. Anthropologists studied other cultures, whereas sociologists studied their own society. But the situation is, to put it mildly, anomalous from the point of view of the Indian university, where many of the best students of society and culture are in departments of sociology rather than of anthropology. Students of society and culture in India sometimes say They sometimes say that they should proceed with their own studies in their own way and not lose their sleep over the ways in which the disciplines are divided in the West between the study of one's own society and the study of other cultures. That would be to take a narrow and ahistorical view of their own intellectual aims and objectives. My view has always been that Indians must take the achievements of Western science and scholarship very seriously, even if their own achievements are not taken seriously on an intellectual plane in the West. The systematic study of society and culture in India is bound by strong umbilical ties to the disciplines concerned with the same kinds of study in the West. When Indians go for study and research to the centers of learning in Europe and America, they cannot but engage with ideas about disciplinary identities and disciplinary boundaries currently in vogue. When they return, they naturally bring back with them new ideas about the study of society and culture that they then seek to apply in their teaching and research, in India that is. Where there is a conspicuous lack of fit between those ideas and the demands of research in Indian academic institutions, there is bound to be some disorientation. New ideas, concepts, and methods have to be related to the existing social and cultural reality, which differs from one country to another. They've also to be related to the existing practices of scholarly work, which also differ among countries. In the development of academic disciplines, the second is no less important than the first. Indians who return after long exposure to a European or an American academic environment may pay attention to the distinctive features of Indian society and culture in their empirical research, but they tend to show scant regard for the traditions of work established in the centers of study and research in India. I have surprised some of them by pointing out that there are indeed such traditions, no matter how weakly developed. Sociology and anthropology have universities, in some cases continuously, for more than 3/4 of a century. While sociology aims to be a single discipline, it is undeniable that different traditions of study and research have grown within it. This is a good thing, so long as each tradition remains open to influences from the others. As far back as in the 1930s, Karl Mannheim wrote 2 papers, one on American sociology and the other on German sociology. He was not arguing that they were incompatible or inconsistent with each other, but they were different in their orientations. There are several reasons why a distinctive style of sociological study and research has failed to emerge in India, of which one is of particular relevance to the present context. In each generation, the most active among the younger sociologists are eager to remain in close touch with current developments in the major metropolitan centers, but make hardly any effort to relate their work to that of their Indian predecessors. A healthy tradition of research cannot grow unless there is some sense of continuity with the work done in one's immediate environment, along with openness to influences from outside. Of special significance here is the small but growing number of anthropologists in the Indian diaspora. Their outlook, not unexpectedly, is shaped by work practices prevalent in Europe and America rather than India, even though many of them choose India as the site of their fieldwork. No doubt they bring to the study of Indian society and culture new methods and techniques of study, but they come to India to do fieldwork rather than to establish meaningful dialogues with their Indian counterparts. They are too comfortable to move out of the division of intellectual labor established in the metropolitan centers of learning, and they find little in the Indian academic environment to tempt them to look at their own work from a different angle. In my experience, they show even less interest in the work being done in the Indian universities and research centers than their native-born European and American colleagues do. So far at least, students of society and culture in the Indian diaspora have not thrown their weight in favor of work practices and habits that are conducive to the development of a single discipline devoted to the study of all societies by a common body of concepts, methods, and theories. By and large, their basic intellectual approach remains one that takes for granted the separation of the study of other cultures from the study of one's own society. Whether that makes them more cosmopolitan than their colleagues who live and work in their own country is not an easy question to answer. I would like to emphasize that whether one calls oneself and is called a sociologist or an anthropologist is not just a matter of professional organization or career advancement. But also raises important questions of intellectual orientation. Until the 1950s, students of Indian society, whether native or foreign, did not seriously think through the implications of viewing the same subject of study from more than one standpoint. I don't think that anthropologists, certainly anthropologists who worked in India or worked elsewhere, did not take this problem seriously. And it's interesting that the first Indian sociologist who began to agonize about this problem was a man who was at that time India's most outstanding sociologist, Alan Macfarlane. Macfarlane had, I think he was the first Indian scholar who had been accepted as an Oxford anthropologist into the mainstream of British anthropology. So there was a very important question of identity that he had to resolve. In Oxford, he was an anthropologist. In India, he was a sociologist. I believe that the first person for whom this became a serious concern was Alan Macfarlane. He designated it as lecturer in Indian sociology. Although Srinivas taught only briefly at the Institute of Social Anthropology, he maintained close personal as well as professional ties throughout his life with anthropologists in Britain and America. He was present at the foundation of the Association of Social Anthropologists because he was in Oxford in 1946, and the tribe of British anthropologists at that time was a very small one. And he knew the people very closely who were, so he had been Rachel Brown's student, and then he became Alan Pritchard's student. And in 1946, he moved from being Rachel Brown's student to becoming Alan Pritchard's student. And he was also a very close friend of Max Gluckman. He knew Meyer Fortis. In fact, he had been supervised by Meyer Fortis very briefly. So he was present at the foundation of the association. Although Srinivas taught very briefly at the Institute of Social Anthropology, he maintained close personal ties as well as professional ones throughout his life with anthropologists in Britain and America. At the same time, in India, he came to be regarded as the country's foremost sociologist. He began his observations on the study of one's own society by referring to comments on his work by three leading British anthropologists, A.R. Radcliffe Brown, Godfrey Leonhardt, and Edmund Leach. Radcliffe Brown took the simple view that his knowledge of the language and the culture of the region gave Srinivas a great advantage in his study of the Cooks. Leonhardt, once his fellow student and colleague at Oxford, wrote, on the other hand, that he was perhaps at his best when he ceased to feel that he must write in the language of social anthropology and expressed himself as a cultivated Indian. This must have rankled with Srinivas, for whatever he might have wanted to be, certainly at that time he thought it important to write in the language of social anthropology. Leach drew attention more pointedly to the disadvantage of the anthropologist who undertakes to study his own society. Srinivas was provoked into saying, and I quote, Leach in fact said that you can't do this kind of thing. This is not a feasible venture intellectually. Srinivas was provoked into saying, and I quote, whatever the disadvantage that is in the study of one's own society, it has certainly not been so great as to prevent the emergence of the discipline of sociology. Marx, Weber, Mannheim, and several other sociologists have been continuously preoccupied with the study of their own societies. The dilemma arising from the study of one's own society has troubled many Indian anthropologists, particularly those who have studied or worked in the United States or Britain. Considering their large and growing numbers, few Indian anthropologists do field work outside India. But then India is not like Holland or England. It is a very large country where the anthropologist can easily find for study a community that is different from his own in language, religion, and culture. Indian anthropologists, in fact, began with the study of tribes in Jharkhand and the Northeast, whose customs were very different from those of the anthropologist, even when he was an Indian. But as I have pointed out, this is largely a matter of perspective. Most Indians would say that they were studying other Indians, even when they study regions or communities other than their own. At any rate, I do not know many anthropologists in Delhi or Calcutta who would regard themselves as the astronomers of the social sciences when they are studying tribal communities in India. And besides, there are now today many Khasi, Munda, Oraon anthropologists who study their own as well as other communities. Srinivas spoke and wrote endlessly on the issues raised by Levi-Strauss and Leach. In the study of society and culture, who has the advantage, the insider or the outsider? This became a major preoccupation with Srinivas. In a paper entitled The Insider versus the Outsider in the Study of Cultures, Srinivas sought to present a nuanced view in response to Leach's categorical assertion of the advantage of the outsider. He acknowledged that the outsider enjoyed certain advantages, but he insisted that the insider too had his own advantages. The view of the anthropologist as the astronomer of the social scientists may appear as a harmless pose in Europe or America, but it puts the Asian or African anthropologist working in his own country on the wrong foot with his countrymen. There are other reasons too, some of them not very pleasant ones, why anthropology is viewed with suspicion in the ex-colonial countries. Some believe that the Indian anthropologist enjoys a natural advantage in the study of his own society and culture. The question is then asked as to why, when there are so many able scholars within the country, anthropologists from abroad should come to undertake studies in India, when their initial knowledge of language and society can never be on a par with that of the native scholar. Such studies no doubt advance the professional careers of those who undertake them, but do they add anything of value to India's own intellectual capital? Here I would like to say that my own view is that it very certainly does add to the intellectual capital of India when others from outside come and study Indian society along with Indians who study their own society. Although he himself did not study systematically any society outside India, Srinivas maintained consistently that research by anthropologists from other countries contributed something of inestimable value to the understanding of Indian society and culture. He wrote in his discussion of the insider versus the outsider, I quote, "I must hasten to add that I am not only not against studies of a culture by outsiders, but on the contrary, I am positively for them," with underline. He concluded, I quote, "There cannot be a single correct or all-embracing view. One view ought to be that of the insider, and various views can be complementary even when, or especially when, they differ from each other," unquote. Clearly, Leach was being provocative in asserting that a valid account of a society can be provided only by one who views it from the outside. It will not be very sensible to respond to the provocation by saying that true insight into a society can be attained only from within, and that the outsider's account is doomed to remain shallow and misleading. Just as many theologians believe that a religion can be fully understood only by a true believer, so do many nationalists believe that their society can be understood only by someone born and bred in it. Such a view I consider to be misleading and intellectually sterile. I would plead for the recognition of the validity of a multiplicity of standpoints, and thus try to reach beyond the dichotomy of insiders and outsiders. I think there's a world of difference between seeing the study of society and culture divided between studies made by outsiders and studies made by insiders, and recognizing the importance and the value of a multiplicity of standpoints. Anthropology, or what was then called ethnology on the continent of Europe, was closely associated in its early phase with the exploration of distant lands and alien communities. Not all anthropologists were themselves explorers or even travelers, but they were more dependent than other social scientists on the writings of explorers and travelers. Even before World War I, anthropologists such as Boas, Haddon, and Rivers went on expeditions. In this, they were more like geographers than economists, political scientists, or sociologists. Perhaps this explains why the British Academy, when it reorganized its sections in 1993, placed social anthropology with geography and separated it from sociology. Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown played an important part in redefining anthropology as a field science in which anthropologists themselves went out to distant places and collected their own data in conformity with professional standards instead of relying on accounts by explorers, travelers, and missionaries. Hence, going out to do fieldwork, being there, as Clifford Geertz puts it, became a mark of distinction among anthropologists, particularly in Britain. Anthropologists who lived away from the city sought to evoke the atmosphere of the bush and the camp. And some of them cultivated what Evans Pritchard rather disdainfully called the rustling of the wind in the palm trees kind of anthropological writing, for which Malinowski set the fashion. No anthropologist in our time has evoked the enchantment of distant lands more vividly than Lévi-Strauss. It is unlikely that another book such as Tristropique can be written today, at least by an anthropologist. The world has changed in the last 60 years, and in some ways irreversibly. No matter how much the anthropologist or his reader might yearn for the charm of faraway places, being there cannot mean the same thing today as it did in Malinowski's time or in the time of Evans Pritchard and Lévi-Strauss. The places where anthropologists might like to do fieldwork have now been invaded by tourists, and they are likely to find that reporters and travel writers with a smattering of anthropology have been there before them. It will be reasonable to assume that anthropologists are required by their work to travel further and more frequently than economists, political scientists, and sociologists. They are understandably and justifiably proud of their first-hand knowledge of distant places and unfamiliar people. Does travel to faraway places necessarily make a person cosmopolitan? Or conversely, does one fail to become cosmopolitan by living and working in one's own country? Here the comparison has to be not only between Indian and Western anthropologists, but also between Indian anthropologists who live and work in India and those who have chosen to live overseas. Being cosmopolitan is a matter of sympathy and understanding. It would be rash to assume that one's sympathy and understanding are automatically enlarged by long stay among members of a small community in a distant place. Much depends on the attitude of mind with which one undertakes the study of other lives. Fraser certainly did not believe that his intellectual horizons would be enlarged by close encounters with savages, but he was an anthropologist before the days of intensive fieldwork. Intensive fieldwork brought the anthropologist into direct and often close relationship with the native. But as I have said, it did not change everything. Malinowski, Radcliffe Brown, and their pupils, who laid the foundations of intensive fieldwork among anthropologists in Britain, worked during the closing decades of colonial rule and under its shadow, where the line between Europeans and natives was well recognized on both sides. No doubt there were close, even intimate relations between European anthropologists and some of their native informants, just as there were between European officers and some of their native soldiers. In fact, some of the best fieldwork by British anthropologists was done during the war, and Evans Pritchard has left a vivid account of his work in East Africa as officer and anthropologist. While there is no doubt an element of caricature in Homans' account, it is by and large true that those anthropologists who laid the foundations of intensive fieldwork undertook research among natives who did not talk back. I'm now talking about the 20s and 30s and 40s. It is not difficult to establish close relations with people who do not talk back. It's easy, in fact, to establish close relations with them. If there was reciprocity between the anthropologist and his informant, it was at best on an emotional rather than an intellectual plane. Anthropologists who did fieldwork in the second quarter of the last century in Melanesia, Polynesia, and Africa generally took for granted the vast disparity between the intellectual resources of their own civilization and those of the pre-literate societies they undertook to study. No doubt, they discussed the intellectual puzzles thrown up by Trobriand culture or Azande culture with the bearers of those cultures. It is doubtful, though, that the anthropologist discussed the intellectual puzzles embedded in his own culture with his native informants. There is nothing in the literature to suggest that he did so in a serious way. Anthropologists not only went out to study others, the others they chose to study were without conscious or recorded traditions of intellectual debate and discussion. In these circumstances, reciprocity of intellectual perspectives is scarcely possible in a serious way. Being cosmopolitan requires at least the possibility of intellectual debate and discussion among persons viewing society and culture from various standpoints. With decolonization, the terms of the relationship between anthropologists and those they studied began to gradually change. For one thing, anthropologists could no longer operate through the old colonial system for access to the people whom they went out to study. For another, they began to enter the study of civilizations which themselves had old and sometimes very elaborate intellectual traditions. The line of distinction between the anthropologist and the native, which had been clear in the days of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown, and even of Evans Pritchard and Fortis, began to be blurred. The natives were themselves producing anthropologists, and they certainly could talk back. When anthropologists from the United States and Europe began to come in large numbers to do research in countries such as India, Sri Lanka, and Turkey, their first interest naturally was in the tribal or peasant communities in which they did their fieldwork. If the orientation of your discipline is towards the other, when you come to India, you naturally seek out Indian peasants rather than Indian social scientists. It is not easy to tell how much this contributes to a true reciprocity of perspectives which one takes to be the basis of a cosmopolitan outlook. With a rapid increase in the size of the profession in countries such as India, anthropologists who came from overseas to do fieldwork there were made increasingly aware of the presence of native anthropologists. The relationship between visiting and native anthropologists is not always smooth or easy. The visitor prefers a direct and unmediated relationship with the tribals or peasants he has come to study, and sometimes finds that his native counterpart is a nuisance. Anthropologists from overseas find their Indian counterparts ignorant and ill-informed, which many of them indeed are. Indian anthropologists feel that their Western counterparts try to use them as informers, not as colleagues, which some of them do instead of treating them as colleagues. Sometimes the theories of colonial and neo-colonial hegemony that well-meaning Western anthropologists have constructed for their own amusement boomerang on them. Perhaps by the very nature of their vocation, Western anthropologists feel more at ease with African or Asian tribals and peasants than with African or Asian social scientists. This may be a very good thing for their research, but I doubt that it makes them more cosmopolitan. What about Indian social scientists? Does the comparative study of society and culture make them more cosmopolitan? I believe it does, whether or not they travel far and wide, but only if they reject the idea that the line between ourselves and others can be drawn once and for all and must be drawn in the same way by everyone. Today, no Indian can hope to be a serious student of society and culture without engaging with concepts, methods, and theories that originated largely outside his country and have their roots in intellectual traditions other than his own. Social scientists in India agonized endlessly over the adequacy of the existing framework of study and research developed mainly outside their country to the understanding and explanation of their present reality. No existing body of ideas of no matter what provenance is ever wholly adequate to the task of understanding a complex and changing reality. To be cosmopolitan is to be open to ideas irrespective of their provenance, and to be willing to engage with those who view the world from standpoints other than one's own. But one can do so effectively and meaningfully only if one has a standpoint of one's own and knows what that standpoint is. The practice of sociology and social anthropology in India has taught us that whether one studies one's own society or some other society, keeping an open mind is more important than traveling to distant places. It has taught us that there is no one unique or privileged standpoint in the study of society and culture. It does not help very much if we acknowledge only two standpoints, those of the insider and the outsider, in place of one. Even within the same society, there generally are a plurality of standpoints, varying according to religion, class, gender, and political or ideological predilections. And besides, different outsiders may view the same society from different standpoints. Sociology and social anthropology cannot move forward unless the plurality of standpoints is accepted as a fundamental condition for the study of society and culture. Thank you.